welcome to the Marathon Medic podcast. My name's Amy and I'm a junior doctor with an interest in sports medicine. This is a special one-off episode all about the foot. I'm chatting to sports podiatrist Ian Griffiths about foot health, running shoes, orthoses and more. So hi Ian, thank you so much for agreeing to chat with me. I came across your Instagram and all the great information you had about feet, so I thought it'd be really useful to chat with you and ask you some more questions because I think there's a lot that I still don't know. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be invited, and it's also nice to know that there is someone out there that looks at my Instagram. That's a relief.
There was one the other day that said don't trust runners though, so
yeah, that made me. I am a runner myself, so I feel like I'm okay to say that. I didn't feel like I wasn't firing shots at something I'm not, so I felt like it was fair game.
Yeah, it's very true as well. So could you just start off by telling everyone a little bit about yourself and how you got into podiatry as well?
Yeah, of course. So my name's Ian Griffiths and I am based in London. I qualified as a podiatrist in 2003. And prior to that, as I was actually saying this to someone the other day, because we get asked this question quite a lot about podiatry. I think it comes from a position of why would anyone choose to look at feet for the rest of their career, so to speak. But I never grew up desiring podiatry as a career. I'll be honest, I think as a teenager, I probably didn't know what it was. But my only passion and love outside of school was sport. I just loved watching it, loved playing it. My only real aptitude for anything inside school was the sciences and maths. So by any kind of quiz or sort of choose your career kind of algorithm that you pump all this information into, what you end up with is a list of medical professions. And as a teenager, I recall spending time with each one of them and sort of seeing which one looked most interesting. And the day I spent with the podiatrist was, at the time, we're going back to 1999 now. I still remember him. He was great and he was so enthusiastic and he loved his job. And I just thought, wow, this is a way I can get to ingrain myself within the sporting community, because I'm never going to be good enough to be a sportsman or athlete myself, so I may as well be one of those peripheral team members. So I did my bachelor's degree in podiatric medicine. I then did a postgraduate certificate in sports podiatry, and then I did my master's degree in sports and exercise medicine and sports injury. Because the great thing about podiatry, as I'm sure you already know, is that you can take that initial bachelor's degree and you can sort of specialize, I guess, like any branch of medicine, into what sort of demographic or kind of people you'd like to see. So some of my friends I trained with have gone on to become sort of diabetes specialists and wound care and tissue viability specialists. Some have gone into pediatrics. Some look after the geriatric foot. The at-risk foot. Some have gone down the route of more surgical, podiatric surgery type approach. And for me, it was always sports podiatry, musculoskeletal medicine. So that's what I did all my postgraduate study. And so I'm very fortunate that in the private practice I now work in London 3 days a week, I get to see only people with musculoskeletal complaints and sporting injuries. So just that small sort of subspecialty within my podiatry profession.
And you mentioned that you're really into sports yourself. So you're a runner. Is that your main kind of interest, or other sports as well?
Yeah, running is the main one now. Historically, when I was younger, I had more time, and pre-children, when I could disappear for the whole of a Saturday afternoon, it was football. But yeah, present day, it's running and golf. They're the two kind of things I spend my free time doing. I play golf with my oldest son. I run. Yeah, I love golf. I'm viciously average at it, as I am at running, I should probably add. But I'm very enthusiastic, and I knew that golf, when it replaced football, didn't quite give me that same feeling of competitiveness necessarily. It certainly wasn't as it wasn't as able to maintain my cardiovascular fitness, my thinking time. Golf's great, but I needed something a bit more active. So I'd always run after a ball. So I wasn't running after a ball anymore. I just started running. So yeah, it's mostly running now for sure.
And do you tend to see mainly runners that are coming in to see you, or is it a variety of sports?
In practice, I would say 90% are runners, and if they're playing other sports, they're probably running related sports. The work I do outside of the private practice with some of the fortunate enough to work with some professional teams, so a cricket team, a couple of Premier League football teams, the European Golf Tour, and England rugby as well. So I'm not saying we only see runners; we see people from all sports, but most of those involve running, and running is a big demand on the body. When we're the lower limb and foot and ankle sort of specialists that we are, that is a fairly important part of the body when it comes to running. Our main interaction with our environment, our only interaction with our environment is our foot. So in private practice, I would say all the people, the sort of lawyers, the accountants, the non-elite sports people that are coming to see us in clinic for private consultations, 9 times out of 10, yes, they are a runner for sure.
And I think a lot of runners, myself included, if I got an injury, I think naturally it's our first thought to seek the help of a physio. So in what situation do you think actually runners should consider speaking to a sports podiatrist, either alongside a physio or actually maybe first?
Yeah, your point is incredibly well made. In that, and I don't get upset by someone saying I'm going to seek a physio. I think I would that's far preferable, seeking someone to doing the alternative that we see runners do, which is soliciting opinions from strangers on the internet. I'd much rather you went and I don't know, upset you go and see a physio rather than a podiatrist. I'd rather you saw anyone than ask strangers on the internet what worked for them, because we know that's kind of a whole thing in the running community. And you're absolutely right with your comment that it may well be that you don't just see one specialist. A lot of sports injuries do best with a multimodal approach, so a team approach. So almost all, if not all, of the runners we see with, say, knee problems, patellofemoral type symptoms, will end up seeing myself and the physio at some point. There aren't many problems that couldn't benefit from having that kind of dual approach. But I would say with regards to what we do, and just I don't know if I'm hoping everyone's familiar with what podiatry is, but if you're not, and your first thing you now think to do is to reach for your phone and Google what is podiatry, the Wikipedia or modern day dictionary definition of podiatry, I suspect is something along the lines of it being the branch of medicine that pertains to the study, the assessment, the diagnosis, and the management of foot, ankle, and lower extremity problems. I think that's probably the loosest one from memory I can think of. That doesn't mean every lower limb problem needs to come to a podiatrist, of course. Also, as podiatrists specialize in different areas, it may well be that some are very, very happy seeing you for a knee problem, but others it may be best to see the physio first. If I explain the way it works in our team, even if people do go and see the physio first, and the physios that I work with them, because we're such a good team, they will then have that discussion of, okay, there's always things a physio can do. Reassurance, diagnosis, education, advice on training habits, which is the big one. And if then as part of that, and maybe even some homework that they give you, some rehab, some things to improve strength and tissue capacity. But at some point, the physios I work with, if they feel that there's a need for a podiatric kind of pair of eyes, they will then flag that. So you might go and see the physio first, but in good teams, you'll probably then be passed on to the podiatrist if they think that we can help. And ultimately, in that sort of setting, what we will usually do is be responsible for assessing your patterns of movement. So how are you moving over the ground when you run? Is there anything in the way you move, whether it be your technique, your stride length, your cadence, your step width, or whether indeed it be the classic sort of mechanics of your foot, so what it does when it hits the ground? Is there anything we see there that we think may correlate with the reason that you developed the problem in the first place, or that we think we may have some wiggle room to improve to mitigate the risk of it happening again, or to just make you a stronger, more robust runner in general?
And it may be a difficult question. Is this quite an individualized thing? So for each runner, do you notice different weaknesses or problems with their biomechanics? Or do you find generally when you see runners, say that weekend warriors, so people that are just going out the weekends and doing loads of running, do you notice particular themes about where people need to improve?
So with regard to visual observations and movement patterns and, what someone looks like and how they move and their alignment, variation is wide and vast, and that is completely normal. We need to accept that. And I know that sits uncomfortably with a lot of runners in particular, because they go searching for answers. They go searching for answers of what is the best cadence, what is the best drop of running shoe, what they want to know, especially the ones who are very new to running. What do I need to buy? What do I need to do? How do I need to do X, Y, Z? And the thought process of there being one way for all runners to do something, the more you think about how variable the human race is. We're all different. We all have different strengths, different weaknesses. We all have different goals. The idea of there being one cadence or one drop or one running technique or one running shoe for any given individual just becomes really difficult to even understand how we can subscribe to that. But that's what runners want. They want black and white dichotomous answers, which is difficult. No blanket approaches. So yes, with regard to the things we see, every runner that comes in to see any of us in clinic is an individual, and N equals one case study, if you will. With regard to the themes that emerge, we are seeing injured runners, and injured runners do, as a group of individuals, as we've just said, they do share that. We do see themes emerge as you do in clinical practice over the years. But those themes are probably more behavioral and psychological than they are anatomical or biomechanical, if that makes sense. So it isn't the case that we say we always see injured runners with certain foot posture, or we always see injured runners with leg length differences. That's not the case, but we do always see injured runners with certain traits, certain behaviors, and the biggest one is training error. It always comes back to training error. So when we look at our weekend warriors, to use that term affectionately, not in a negative way, because I'm one myself, of course. When we look at their behaviors, their habits, the way they train, where they source their information from, what we notice is a really, really strong theme of things that, when brought together, are the perfect storm to increase injury risk. And we should say the risk of injury when running is always greater than zero. We can never prevent injury, but we can try and do things to mitigate it. So what we tend to find is that most people are very time poor, because of work, because of family, because of life, and that's completely understandable. So what they're then doing is they're crowbarring whatever their training or goals are into the remaining time they have, and they don't always identify whether that's a happy marriage, so to speak. So if you want to train for a 2.5 hour marathon, but you've only got 5 hours a week to spare, right from the offset, you need someone to tell you that these things don't marry up very well. So we see people crowbar their training around. We also see, I think the key thing we always ask from any of our runners, whether they're doing their first park run or whether they're doing their 15th London Marathon, is, although the ones who are doing their 15th London Marathon have usually understand this by this point, is we need to build everything, whatever we do, whatever we say, it needs to be built on a bed of consistency. And when we look at the Strava, or this just tends to be what we do now when a runner comes into clinic. The easiest thing, we used to sit there and ask them about their training habits and how much they train and their frequency, their volume, their intensity, and we had to trust they remembered, or trust they sort of articulated it well enough. Now we just say, pass me your Strava. Give me your phone, let me have a look at your Strava. And it's all there. They can't hide from it. And what we see with injured runners, when we look at those past 6, 8, 10, 12 weeks, is like a mountain range, on the Strava green mountain range, where it tells you your weekly volumes. We see 3 weeks of nothing, followed by a week of 40 kilometers, followed by a week of 10 kilometers, it's really up, really down, peaks and troughs. And human tissues, bone, muscle, tendon, they hate holidays and they hate surprises. And the way that most weekend warriors train, unfortunately, is they're in a cycle of doing a little bit too much too soon after having done a bit too little for too long. Being much, much more consistent is the key thing. So we often see runners who've come to us injured, and we say to them, how did this happen? And the story transpires that they went to the running club, or they spoke to a friend or a colleague, and they said, I just want to get faster. So their friend gave them a beautiful hill sprint session, or a lovely technical interval session, or they pulled one off the internet, all which is fine. But when you look at their last 10 weeks of training, there's just been no consistency to build it on top of. And it's like, just spending 3 months hanging out in zone 2, building a really nice big aerobic base, and then building the specialist sessions on top of that are going to place more demand on your tissues in general, is probably going to be a safer way to do this. So I think it's because of human nature. It's because of perhaps human impatience, because we always want to be better than we are, and we always don't want to commit to the really dull, the really boring, the really mundane stuff. It's the stuff that we have to do when no one's looking. It's getting out there tonight in the dark when it's just got cold and just started to rain. It's all that stuff that in April, when we sit and we watch TV and we watch the London Marathon and we see all these amazing inspirational things and we feel all emotional, and as a non-runner, we perhaps think, I'm going to do that next year. What you're seeing is the end point of months and months and months of consistency. And the trait that all injured runners that we see seem to share is those errors in training, those what we would refer to as load management problems. So you've asked something of your body or your body's tissues that at that moment in time it was not able to tolerate. You've exceeded its ability to tolerate something. And over time, the training effect, of course, as you know, means that if we do this in a slow and gradual, safe way, if we gradually expose our body to more things in a sensible way, it adapts and becomes robust and resilient, and it can cope with much more in the future than it did in the past. But making that really big jump is probably the biggest cause of injury, bigger cause than what your foot's doing, to be honest.
That's talking to me a lot. I'm feeling a little bit guilty about my previous training weeks.
I promise I'm not attacking anyone.
Yeah, no, I completely, a lot of that resonated with me. I think it's human nature to just want to go out, and especially if you've had a stressful day as well, just like go on just a faster run when maybe actually you do need to take it easier and build it up. I think another point for me, definitely something that I've learned over the last few months, having neglected it for a while, is the importance of strength work. I don't personally enjoy it. I'd much rather go out on a run, but I realize I can't build up my distance without some of that strength work. And I kind of know I need to build my glutes and all these other different muscles in my lower limbs, and never once have I actually thought about foot strength. So is there anything that runners should be doing to improve their foot health or foot strength? Do you prescribe certain exercises?
Certainly there are exercises you can do for the intrinsics of the foot, and they're well known and they're well documented. And there's obviously some people out there who think they are the pinnacle of what we need to do. They are the priority, and certain promises are sometimes attached with getting strong feet. Now, to your earlier point, I think being strong as a runner is always a positive and never a negative. That, the stronger you can be, the better you will be. And you're not alone in saying, well, why would I run on a Monday? Why would I go to the gym on a Monday when I don't really enjoy the gym, and actually I'd rather go for a run on a Monday. But it does make you a better runner to spend some time not running and doing the things supplementary to your running. And the biggest, I should have mentioned it before, but the biggest crazy thing I see weekend warriors and new runners doing is subscribing to this principle of the run streak. It makes no sense to me why people think this is a thing. I think it's a social media thing. I think they just want to be seen, to be posting something every day. But the run streak is the enemy of the new runner, the weekend warrior, for two reasons. Firstly, there's no rest days, and any good program, always a rest day is just as part of much of the program as your interval session. It's an important session in itself. But also, if you've got no rest days, then you're less likely to do your strength work because you're running every day. You're running 7 days a week, 30 days a month. So coming back to the foot strength thing, I would say the evidence, if we lean into the scientific literature very briefly, isn't particularly overwhelming with regard to the benefits. So I'm not saying that you can't go onto Instagram and see someone's account that promises the world from having strong feet, and it will reduce your injury and it will improve your performance. But I don't know that the data supports that. And I don't know if you've ever tried to do intrinsic foot muscle exercises, but they're, if you don't really enjoy doing strength work, for example, whatever that may entail for people, squats, deadlifts, if you don't enjoy that, you're really not going to enjoy intrinsic foot muscle exercises because they're just pretty boring to do. And for the time you have to spend doing them, the input you have to give for the potential output you're going to get is a bit of a mismatch for me. And I would say if we have runners like yourself that are very open and honest and say, I'm not really a big fan of doing strength. I know I need to do it. I mean, you're one step ahead of some people because at least you admit you need to do it, right? But I mean, I know I need to do it. I don't enjoy doing it. It's a real chore to do it. With those people, you need to make sure that what they do, that they're doing the big wins first. So the two muscle groups that we would say, and you've mentioned one of them, the glutes and the calf complex, in particular, the soleus component of the calf complex. For me, if I see someone that sits at a desk all day or has a fairly sedentary day and they want to maintain a high running volume, we know that these muscles are very, very important for running. So if I know that someone's not wasting but using 30 minutes of their time to do foot intrinsic exercises at a cost of not doing hip abduction stuff, glute max stuff, seated calf raises for their soleus, then not only is that intrinsic foot muscle exercise negligible with how much benefit it's going to give you, you could argue it's having a detrimental effect because it's robbing you of time where you could be doing something a bit more priority. So if you're doing everything beautifully, you're doing your proximal strength stuff, your hip and your glute strength stuff, you're doing your soleus stuff, you're eating well, you're sleeping well, all those other things that we know are important. You are training sensibly, you're having rest days. If you're nailing it, which no runner does, myself included, by the way, but if you are nailing it and you say, hey, I've read something in Runner's World about picking up a pencil or crunching a toe with my feet, what do you think? I'd say go for it. Absolutely. But there's not many runners, I think, that come under that category. And I hate the idea of them not wasting time, but spending time doing something lower down the priority list, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think strength work does take quite a lot of time, doesn't it? So you do need to definitely make sure it's something that preferably you enjoy at least a little bit to keep you motivated.
Absolutely.
And it's also going to pay off in the long term. I feel like we can't talk about feet without talking about shoes.
Agree. Yeah.
Half of why runners run is to buy new running shoes.
Agree.
So what tips would you give to people that are buying running shoes? Because I think we're bombarded with a lot of bright colors, fancy designs, bold statements about what a shoe can do. So for a runner going into a running store, what would be your kind of main bits of advice?
Yeah, it's the big question, isn't it? And I agree. Buying shoes and having a range of shoes is one of the most fun bits about being a runner. My wife's constantly telling me off for my growing shoe collection, and she's now employed what we refer to in our house as the nightclub policy, which is a 1 in, 1 out policy. So now she says for every pair of shoes that comes in the house, a pair of shoes has to leave the house. So I have to sneak them in now, but it's fun. But there's also it's not just fun to get something new or get a different colorway. There is reasonable sense in having a range of different shoes, for reasons we'll probably come on to. Because I think historically you'd go into a running store, you'd see a professional of some kind. They would advise you on the shoe that was best for you based on whatever decision they made at the time. And then for whatever reason, it was assumed that was a life sentence. So I still see people now, as you may do, where they come in and they're in an Asics Kayano 26. And I say, okay, so talk to me about your shoes. What do you run in? This is the only shoe I run in. I do every single run, every single session in this shoe, and I have done for 10 years. I've had the 26, the 25, the 24, the 23. They're the kind of person that will lose their mind if Asics ever discontinued that model. Because now what do? I found my shoe, and it's so strange to me that anyone would consider a shoe a life sentence. Like 10 years ago, whether it was a right or wrong recommendation is one discussion, but actually, even if it was the perfect recommendation at that time, in 10 years, you must have evolved or changed as a runner in some way that perhaps there's a different shoe that's more appropriate for you now. Or the way we tend to frame it is different shoes for different tasks. So rather than matching the human or the human's foot to a specific shoe, which is kind of what the model has been, which is you need a neutral shoe, you need a stability shoe. You speak to any runner that's been running for a long period of time or is much more experienced or runs to a good level, and they don't just have one pair of shoes. Far from it. They have multiple pairs, and not just because they love buying shoes, but because they know that on a day they wake up and their calves are a bit sore because of yesterday's interval session, there's a certain pair of shoes they may reach for because they know that these shoes make their calves feel better. On a day that they're doing some speed work, they'll reach for that pair of shoes. On a day that it's race day, they'll reach for that pair of shoes. The long, slow, steady Sunday, 2-hour job, they'll reach for a different pair of shoes. Shoes have tasks. So I think the problem we have is people are so fearful that they should move around and wear different shoes because, I was told I needed this shoe because my foot does X, Y, or Z. And like I say, the shoe's been given way too much attention and credit for its ability to either injure people or reduce injury risk. I'm not saying it's completely irrelevant and it's not important, but it's far more nuanced than I think people appreciate. And again, it speaks back to runners wanting answers. What cadence do I run at? What drop do I need? Do I need a stability shoe or a neutral shoe? And there are no blanket approaches to these things. So I would say to most runners, and we should probably, I always forget to do this, we should probably talk about uninjured runners and injured runners separately here. So we'll talk about the uninjured runners first. They're the most challenging because you're uninjured, you go into a store, you want some advice, perhaps you're new and you're not sure because there's a wall of shoes in front of you. It's a bit overwhelming. And you say, okay, I'm sort of at the mercy of the person selling me these shoes here. How do we advise the uninjured new runner which shoes to buy that are best for them? It's really, really the most challenging task. And the reason it's challenging is because we're not as good as we all pretend to be at knowing exactly what causes injury in the first place. Injury is complex and it's multifactorial. So they're really, really challenging cases. And most of the time when we're trying to find the best shoe, what people are referring to with the best is the shoe that's going to mitigate injury risk, if that's what shoes can do, and the shoe that's going to improve performance. I think they're the two things that people are looking for. Now, we'll not talk about performance because more recently we have good data that certain shoes do improve performance. There's no denying that now, present day. But historically, we didn't have that. So, people would be matching the shoes to what their foot posture was or what their arch height was or, whether they'd been labeled a pronator or a supinator, in air quotes. I think, again, coming back to what are the big wins, and let's do the big wins first, or an analogy I've stolen from a physiotherapy colleague of mine, which is, if we've got a glass jar and we've got pebbles and sand, big pebbles and sand, let's make sure all the big pebbles are in first, and then we pour in the sand to fill in the gaps around it, rather than fill the jar with sand first, and there's no room for the big pebbles. So the big pebbles, when it comes to injury risk, are the boring stuff we've just kind of alluded to: consistency, good training habits, sleep, nutrition. The big win is not buying a certain pair of shoes and then feeling like you've got a free pass to go and train like a maniac and do whatever you want. So if you're doing all of the big things first, you can probably, to a certain extent, go into the store and be led by comfort. Comfort being a very personal thing, and also your comfort will vary day to day. So what you find comfortable on one day isn't always what you find the most comfortable the next day. So even that in itself is a bit blurry. But you probably find that based on the model of the shoe, the manufacturer, I should say, and knowing that some manufacturers make their shoes slightly wider than others, and if you've got a wide foot or a narrow foot, you'll find some people say, sort of generally, I don't really like Adidas. They come up a bit narrow, which is absolutely small, absolutely true. New Balance, Brooks come up a bit wider. But again, when you go onto the running shoe forums and talk, look at the running shoe geeks nerding out, you only find that out by getting out there and getting your feet into shoes. If you bought an Asics Kayano 10 years ago, you don't even know what other shoes feel like present day. You've been too scared into thinking that you need to stay in this shoe. So most people now, and I'm the same, we can sort of say, okay, I know that shoe comes up a bit narrow, but I know that I'm a size 10 in that model, and I'm a size 10. I'm a size 10 in Nike, but I need to wear an 11 in Adidas, for example. People learn their ways around it. So when you're buying shoes, I wish I had better answers. I'm conscious that runners potentially listening are thinking, just tell me what I need to look for. Do I need cushioning? Do I need zero drop? Do I need and the answer is, it depends. If you're uninjured, we don't have good data as to which shoe is going to be best for you. So to a certain extent, do the best you can, which is be driven by comfort, and know that that's only a really small piece of the puzzle when it comes to injury and performance anyway. All the other stuff that you can be doing is probably more important. Now, when we come to injured runners, this is different. And I'm very spoiled in that if I'm seeing a runner, they're probably injured, which is not good for them, but it's good for me because what it suddenly gives me now is context. And if someone comes in, what we can do with their footwear is we can make a recommendation based on what we're trying to achieve at that time. So we sort of loosely refer to it as pathology-specific prescribing. So what we mean by that is if you have a very sensitive Achilles tendon, or you're recovering from a calf strain, then it makes sense that we can say, right, the best shoe for you right now is a shoe with a higher drop, because a higher drop will reduce some of those pulling forces, those tensile forces on the Achilles. And we need to be really clear that that isn't us saying this person needs a high drop shoe as a life sentence. A shoe recommendation is contextual and temporal, meaning at that moment in time, that person probably needs a high drop shoe to take a bit of load off their calf. Likewise, if they have a posterior ankle impingement, like an accessory bone there, like an ostrigonum or an irritated sort of Kager's fat pad, then being in that ankle being in that slightly plantar flex position of a high drop is probably going to be more irritable than helpful. So we may guide those people towards a low drop shoe at that moment in time. In the forefoot, when we've got things, runners may be familiar with things like Morton's neuromas and bursas and those sort of space-occupying lesions. They're really sensitive to compression. They're the ones where runners will be familiar that they feel much worse in their work shoes or their brogues or their formal shoes than they do when they're barefoot, because the foot's being squeezed and that swollen nerve in between the metatarsals is being sort of compressed. They're the ones that we might guide towards a shoe with a wider toe box. They also do quite well with rocker soles. So, the kind of the large toe spring shoes or the rocker sole geometry that Hoka have, but a lot of these companies have them now. And some of the carbon plated shoes are quite aggressively toe sprung as well. They're really good for people with irritable toe joints, metatarsophalangeal joints. So if you've got a really sore or even a really stiff or even arthritic big toe joint, i.e. it doesn't bend much, and when it does bend, it hurts, then a stiff forefoot with a rocker sole is going to feel like a dream to you, because ultimately it's going to take some of the load off those tissues. So I'd love runners to appreciate that when we're recommending shoes, we're usually doing so in the context of something is sore or sensitive. We want to offload it as part of that recovery program, but we also want to keep runners moving and running as best we can. So rather than recommending shoes based on your foot posture or your alignment or and therefore the shoe then correcting you and being a life sentence that you rely on or dependent on, think of shoes as just one of the tools that can modify the way loads are distributed around the lower limb. And at different times and different days and in areas of different soreness, different shoes will be applicable.
I think that's really useful to know, and I think we're often trapped in thinking that we need a certain thing, and actually we need to be a bit more flexible and just try things out. One thing I wanted to ask you, actually, which is a bit of a myth that I've never known is true, is that after you run, you should leave your shoes 24 hours for the cushion to re-expand. And I think this is a common held belief, but I actually have no idea if it's based on any evidence. Could you shed any light on that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. The shoe the material science data is kind of what we're talking about here. So I think all shoes used to essentially be made of some version of EVA. So, if you go back 10, 15 years, you had all of the papers that looked at running and running shoes and their ability or their influence or interaction with injury. And then you went into the engineering journals, and you had how these materials responded to cyclical loads. So they were put in a lab and sort of repetitively and cyclically loaded to try and mimic the foot landing, as it does when we run. So we do have some data, or there are data that exist that tell us, when EVA sort of loses its material properties and at what, after how many load cycles, and therefore that can be extrapolated to when should we change our shoes after so many kilometers. But to my knowledge, we have never had those two things marry. So we've got the lab-based engineering work, we've got the clinical or the pragmatic real-world work. But to my knowledge, we've never, I'm not aware of a single paper that's ever said, right, let's take some running shoes that have just been worn and have a look at them. I think the theory was that foam or midsole materials compress as we load them. if we go out for a run, then, in theory, you'd measure the stack height of the midsole before the run. You'd measure the stack height after the run, and perhaps because it's compressed, it would be slightly lower. And it needed time to then kind of, almost like a memory foam mattress, visualize it like that. I think the idea was, and I've heard this myth myself, give it 24 hours, 48 hours for it to kind of return to its aforementioned state. I don't think there's any science behind it at all. And obviously, we've now got many more different materials that we're using in midsoles other than just EVA. And again, if you subscribe to the principle of rotating shoes, because shoes are fun to buy, and because of the reasons we've said, like your shoe should probably be dependent on the task you're doing that day. It's probably rare you wear the same shoe 2 days in a row anyway, for most runners I speak to. That said, the last 3 days in a row three runs that I've done in exactly the same shoe, because they've just been 3 easy runs, and it's my favorite easy run shoe. And I'm not too worried or concerned about wearing it 3 sessions in a row. But again, even if you only have, even if there was science behind this, which I don't think there is, I could really only see it being a problem if a runner had one pair of shoes and they were a run streaker and running every single day. They're 2 things that I would encourage all runners to not be. Don't be the runner that only has one pair of shoes, and don't be a run streaker. So, that way, at least if it was true, you're covering your bases anyway.
And on the topic of myths and misconceptions, what do you think are the common misconceptions that runners have, I guess specifically about the feet or shoes, that you kind of wish you could change?
Yeah, there's so many. It is an area that seems to be saturated with myth and belief, and beliefs are obviously fed into by myths as well. And again, because of the runner, I feel so sorry for runners, because they're surrounded by sources of information, the internet, the magazines, the colleagues at the running club, which just perpetuate whatever's been out there for a few years and it's been said enough times. It just gets perpetuated. So how do you ever break down these beliefs? So I would say there's a couple of big ones. Where do we start? So let's start with what runners believe about themselves, because we know runners love talking about running, myself and yourself included.
I'm quite guilty of that.
Yeah, I will talk running to anyone that will listen. And if they're not a runner, you can see them just glaze over. But we know runners love talking about running, and they love talking about themselves. They love talking about what they're doing and how they're doing it. And in our clinical interactions, this is great, because what we're trying to do is really, when we're trying to extract an accurate history from someone, we want to know these things. So that's why I think runners are great to see in clinic, because, whereas at Christmas dinner, none of your family care about what your last run, the pace your last run was done at, or as medical professionals, we do care. We want all of this information. And it's interesting the way they self-identify as certain things. So the 2 things I think runners at foot level will very, very quickly sort of offer up to me in clinic is whether they believe what they believe about their magnitude of pronation. So whether they are a pronator, or dare we use the word overpronator. So they, and that may be something they've self-identified, or they've been told, or they've Googled, but they will very, very quickly tell me, how much they pronate. Like I'm not about to look at it anyway, but yeah, that's the thing they'll tell me, their opinion of how much they pronate. And the other thing they'll tell me is what sort of foot strike they adopt. So yeah, I'm a heel striker, and or I'm a forefoot striker, or a midfoot striker. And the interesting thing is that they're more often than not wrong about themselves. And I don't just mean about their pronation magnitude, I mean about their foot strike patterns. And there was a paper published, I think it was in the last 12 months, although this year's been so blurry, it might have been year before this. And it showed that when you ask runners, are you a heel striker, midfoot striker, forefoot striker, and they very confidently state what they are, then when you look at them running, over 50% aren't what they think they are. So I think people have just got real myths about themselves. They think this is what they do, and they don't. And they also then think that means something. So the myths surrounded by how I strike and what that means. So heel striking is bad, forefoot striking is good. I guess that's one of the key kind of false dichotomies out there, that there's one way to run, that one way is more natural, that heel striking is evil and the cause of all ills. Again, the scientific literature just does not support this. So the big myths, I think, are what cause injury in that way. So they've done this study as well. They've done some great studies, questionnaires to runners. So they not only showed that over half the time runners are inaccurate about their own foot strike and their own pronation magnitude. They sometimes even get their own arch height wrong. Runners often will say to us, I've got high arches or I've got low arches. They don't always get that right because, of course, their reference point's different, isn't it? Where something is high, well, it depends on the spectrum of things you've seen. They also give that too much credence as being important as well, but that's another thing. But the other thing is they ask a load of runners, what do you think the most important things are with regard to injury? So what do you think cause injury? And the list of things runners think cause injury are not the list of things that the data tells us are the biggest injury risks. So they're probably the really, really big ones. Runners, if we were in a ideal world, blue sky thinking, we could somehow permeate these kind of levels of education down to runners and sort of say, look, the stuff that you're being fed on a monthly basis in the magazines is possibly a wee bit out of date. We did an experiment a few years ago now where we dug out an old, I won't say what magazine it was, but we dug out an old copy of a running magazine from, I think it was from like 95, and it was in fairly good condition. And we left it on the coffee table in the reception waiting area of one of our clinics for a month. So bear in mind, it was 20 years old. And, runners, when they're sitting there waiting for their appointments, they flick through the magazines. And I promise you, none of them noticed. And that kind of just, as a medical professional, we're constantly trying to learn more. We don't pretend to have all the answers present day, but we'd like to think we have more answers than we did have 20 years ago. Even though we don't know what's right in all cases, we're better at being less wrong than we used to be. But the things we say in clinic, the Instagram posts we put up, these podcasts that we do, unfortunately, excuse me, don't make a massive dent in the sort of wider media that runners are subjected to. So I would say, most runners are probably not as well informed as they could be about what causes injury. They probably are incorrect and pay too much attention to what their foot looks like, how it behaves, what bit of it hits the ground first, and then finally, how they think injury needs to be treated. They're a little bit off base with that sometimes as well. And you only need to dive into, the internet forums, the Facebook groups, which I lurk on, not to do anything other than to try and get into the psyche of the people I try and help for a living. And it's a fascinating experience. It's a real kind of human behavior sort of experiment here where they'll happily ask strangers on the internet. Those strangers will happily put forward what worked for them with no other kind of context whatsoever. And I guess I'd love the idea that a runner would say, okay, I've got a problem. It's probably specific to me. I'm going to go and see someone about it. They're going to tell me, things that potentially contribute to this problem. Reassure me with what the problem is, clear anything sinister, give me a management plan or a strategy to get back on track, and hopefully out of this injury experience, I emerge a better runner, a stronger runner, or a more robust runner, but also a better informed runner. And you look at any runner that's been through significant injuries, their approach to injury in the future is far better. So I don't know if I've waffled on, and I'm not sure if I've diverted and I've answered that question particularly well, but yeah.
I think actually I just wanted to ask you on that topic of misinformation, and you mentioned lots of the sources which aren't the best for seeking out information about running. Have you got any tips about where people should go to get good information, or do you think it very much is a case of seeing a healthcare professional when it's needed because it's so individualized?
Yeah, ideally you would develop a problem and you would see someone. Now, I appreciate that isn't always possible. There are various hurdles that prevent that from being a reasonable option for everyone. And I think this is why people, because they're time poor, or because often with sports injury, you're probably having to go privately, and if you don't have private medical insurance, it can be very costly. So it's costly both in financial terms and in time terms, and it would be the ideal thing to do, because then you can get really, really tailored advice. Now, I think the reason that people go online is to avoid those hurdles, but also what we know is that a lot of the running injuries we see probably are fairly common. There's a handful of running injuries that crop up regularly for the reasons we've already mentioned, by the way, because they were making the same errors in training and things. But I think you could go on and you could say, oh, my shin hurts every time I run. And someone jumps in who says, oh, my shin used to hurt every time I ran, and I was told I had shin splints. And then a third person jumps in and said, I rubbed magnesium paste on mine and it was gone within a week. And the fourth person jumps in and says, I wear compression socks and I find them really helpful. And then a fifth person jumps in and says, I foam roll my calf. Now, this person probably does have low-level medial tibial stress syndrome. Let's be honest. If a runner's shin hurts and we're thinking, we're hearing hooves and we're thinking horses rather than zebras, that's probably what it is. But before we get into all of the solicited information they've had from or anecdote of what's worked for me, let's go back a step and say there are other things that can cause shin pain, and that some of them are things that we'd probably want to exclude fairly quickly, like tibial stress fractures, for example. And you can't do that on the internet. Strangers can't do that. So I think it's difficult because there isn't really any way you can go online and get great information. There is great information out there, but it's never going to be tailored to you. And there are a couple of questions, and this as a medical professional yourself, when we first meet someone, there are a few questions we ask them fairly quickly to sort of exclude the sinister, or to at least see where our level of, is there anything that raises my index of suspicion of this being something more than what it looks like on face value? So rather than saying my shin hurts when I run, and then suddenly someone jumping in with the management for it, a medical professional would sort of say, okay, tell me what it feels like, and tell me, can you run through it? After the run, how long does it hang around for? Is it interrupting your sleep? Is it giving you night pain? All of these questions kind of, with the answers to them, we can sort of build up a bit of clinical picture and say, there's a few things about this I don't like. Then we can obviously ask health questions like, okay, we know how much volume you're doing, but are you a 55-year-old menopausal vegetarian who's a heavy smoker? Because now all of those things tell me that your bone capacity probably isn't ideal. And now I've got more suspicion that this may be a bone issue rather than a medial tibial stress syndrome type problem. So these are the nuances to the medical interaction that you won't get on the internet. Regardless of the quality of the source, it will never be tailored and individual to you. So I'd like to think the value of seeing a medical professional would be the reassurance of what you are dealing with and what you're not dealing with. When we come on to the "it worked for me" phenomena, we're into a whole new world of craziness where we know that humans all of us are incredibly susceptible to being tricked by our own minds, to committing flaws in or errors in thinking. And sometimes, and the biggest one with these things is what we call the post hoc fallacy, which is where you do something and after that moment something happens and you attribute the two. So for example, if in a minute I decide to walk into the kitchen and then I look out the window and I see it started snowing, it would be ridiculous to say I made it snow by walking into the kitchen. Those two things have occurred, but just because one occurred after another on a timeline, it doesn't mean they're linked in any way. And I would suggest if you rub magnesium paste on your leg and then your medial tibial stress syndrome disappears, you could be potentially committing the same error in thinking. Just because it felt better after you did something, it doesn't mean that actually helped. And there's a great paper out there called, which is well written, and I think it's open access, so anyone can access it on the internet, and it's not written in a language that I think would terrify a non-medical professional or non-scientist. And it's called "Why Do Ineffective Treatments Work?" I would encourage all runners to read it, because there are some things that have very little evidence base for working, but runners swear by them working. And I think when you're going on the internet, what you need to bear in mind is you're getting input from runners that may have had the same problem as you. They think they have, but they may not have, because problems are different just because they sound like they're manifest in the same way. And someone telling you what worked for them, whether that's true or not, doesn't mean it will work for you, whether that be what they did, what shoe they changed to, etc., etc. So again, I'd love the idea of there being a really well policed website where people could go, But the reality is the best way, if at all possible, is to get some kind of individual sort of advice and information.
I agree. And I think there's also such a benefit to having that outside perspective, because I think we're terrible at following our own advice. And recently I've been trying to rehab my own injury, and I'm technically doing what's right, but because it's my own injury, I still push it that little bit further. Whereas if someone was telling me exactly what to do, I think I'd listen a lot more. So I think, doctors need doctors, physios probably need their own physios, and just having that person with the outside perspective and not wrapped up in all the emotion that's associated with injury is really helpful as well.
Totally agree. And I don't think you need to be a runner to treat runners, but I think it helps significantly. You could be incredibly knowledgeable with regards to your anatomy, your physiology. You could be an incredible medic or physiotherapist or podiatrist, and you've never run a day in your life. And if someone comes in, you could clear the red flags. You could formulate a medical diagnosis. You could essentially formulate some kind of management plan. I'm not saying you couldn't do that, but would you know what that person's thinking and feeling? Do you understand why they behave the way they behave? And the answer is, if you're not a runner yourself, you probably don't. Whereas if you're a runner, someone's sitting there and you listen to the errors they're making and you're trying to advise them on not making them, but you feel a little bit hypocritical because you're like, I've made this error myself. You're absolutely right. I always say to runners, like, don't think I'm sitting in an ivory tower, like the perfect example of how to train. Like, I get injured. I make training error. I sometimes don't sleep as well as I could. I sometimes don't prioritize the big pebbles. So don't think I'm sort of looking down. This is two runners talking, but I just want you to know that I understand you. I get you. I know why you do what you do.
And finally, I was just hoping if we could briefly touch on the topic of orthotics, what they are and how they can be used for running, particularly obviously in injury.
Yeah, of course. And again, this is something that there's a lot of myths about and a lot of misconceptions. And you speak to most runners and they've had some kind of experience with these. They've heard of them, or they've been given them in the past, or maybe they know someone who's had them. And it sort of comes back to, I guess, what we said a little bit with regard to the running shoes, which is sometimes you're advised that you need something at that time. And then rightly or wrongly, usually wrongly, you're of the belief that that's a life sentence forever. Now, unfortunately, of course, there's a whole sort of historical paradigm out there that sort of undermines what I'm about to say, and it's the reason why people's beliefs about foot orthoses are a bit off base. But you've seen the before and after image of the foot in the evil, air quotes, pronated position, and then it's sitting on an orthosis and it's in a beautiful vertical, well-aligned position. And it's almost like, and there's no science behind that image, by the way. It's almost like someone at some point in time sold the problem to the society in turn, so that they could then sell them the solution. So the first thing to say about feet being in certain positions, they don't consistently and predictably guarantee you're going to get injured. So if you're uninjured and your foot's in a certain position and someone tells you that's going to cause injury, we need to correct you and put you in a different position, I would suggest that you might be given slightly out of date advice there. Secondly, when we've looked at how orthoses work, so what their mechanisms of effect are, what they actually do, it seems that they don't predictably and consistently realign people either, in the way that before and after image promises. And they're much better thought of present day. Our interpretation of the literature present day is to think of them as devices which modify load, rather than to think of them as arch supports or braces. They don't hold the foot. Anyone that wears them knows that you can still move your foot around on top of them. So they don't brace the foot. They don't immobilize the foot. And I would just think of them as another tool that can modify load or redistribute pressure, for example. And once you get out of the mindset of these things being corrective devices, once you move away from it being framed as you're in a bad alignment and these things will put you in a good alignment, if you can move away from that and you can sort of embrace that these things are a tool that we sometimes give to people to offload a sore tissue, in the same way that we kind of talked about pathology-specific prescribing for the running shoes. Sometimes you might want a high drop, a wide toe box. There are certain scenarios where you might want something in the shoe to further offload one of the big tendons, for example. It's a snapshot in time scenario, and it doesn't necessarily mean because you've been given it that it's a life sentence. If you think this thing corrects you or realigns you, it makes sense that you'd be terrified to ever take it out again. But if it's been framed that you've got a sore tendon, this is going to offload this tendon in the short term. The absolute long-term goal is to remove this device and build up the strength and capacity of that tendon, and to re-educate that you don't make the same training error that annoyed this tendon in the first place. Then I think we're in a much better position. So I would say to people, they think of them as one of the tools that we use to rehab or offload sensitive tissues. They are not always a life sentence in the way that they were always thought. That said, little caveat, of course, there are some scenarios where you will need to wear them long term, as there is with all these things, but they aren't for everyone. And at the same time, if we use that kind of false dichotomy model of, it's not true that everyone needs orthoses, but it's also not true that no one needs orthoses. We live in the nuanced middle ground here, where at a certain moment in time for a certain individual, they might be an appropriate part of the rehabilitation strategy, but they are only a part of it. If someone ever gives you orthoses, tells you that you need to wear them for a long period of time with no real plan, and you're not also being asked to see their physiotherapy colleague for the accompanying rehabilitation and homework to do, then that's a little bit, that level of care is probably a bit less than you deserve as a runner.
That's really useful to know, and actually it's something I don't know too much about. I've never had to use them, so that's why I wanted to ask, because I know there's a lot of misconceptions around them. Thank you so much for chatting with me. Definitely a lot of food for thought there. Is there anything else you want to add, or any information you want to share?
No, I would just encourage all runners to be reminded that the human body in general, but certainly the lower limb, the foot, the ankle, the leg, but your entire body is an amazing, I was about to call it a machine, it's probably better thought as an amazing ecosystem. It is robust, it is resilient, and it is adaptive. It is incredibly capable of tolerating the loads and the demands that we place on it, as long as we do those in sensible ways. So I see so much stuff in the world of the foot and ankle, whether it be, you're in a bad alignment, you're in a bad posture, you need orthoses, you need stability running shoes, and all of those things undermine the fact that we should be reminding ourselves that we're robust, resilient, and adaptive. And they sort of seem to promote feelings of fragility and hypervigilance and catastrophization. And I think those things are really negative things to think about your body, particularly as a runner. So you've got to train smart. You can't train like a maniac. You can't cheat the biology and the physics of the situation. But if you're training well and you're being smart and you're sleeping well and you're eating well, then I think you're in a really, really good place. Don't think you can ignore all those things, injure yourself, or overload your tissues, and then search for the magic cure. On the internet, and the magic cure being a compression sock or foam rolling or this shoe or that shoe. I mean, again, the cure of most problems, or the way out of most problems, is usually a modified version of the way into those problems. So, for example, we always talk about running tendons being the biggest problem, or the biggest thing we see tendons get annoyed by is load, sudden, unexpected load that they weren't prepared for. The way you move your way away from having tendon problems is to slowly and gradually expose yourself to load. You don't rest tendons, you load them progressively. So the idea of massage or foam rolling or X, Y, Z being the way out of a problem is probably not addressing what got you into the problem in the first place. And therefore you're possibly more likely for that to be a recurring issue. So remind yourself that you need to do the big things, the big, smart, boring things consistently with monotonous and dull repetition. The human body is an amazing thing that's robust and resilient. Don't stress out too much about the way your foot behaves. It's probably not as big a deal as people have made out. But at the same time, if you're worried about it, or if you rightly or wrongly think it does correlate, then it's okay to see someone and have a chat about it as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And if people do want to find you and find your podcast and all the information that you've got out there on Instagram, where should they head?
Yes, so if you Instagram is where I hang out the most, like most people in this era. And if nothing else, you can come and see my collection of running shoes myself, because I put them all on there. So my Instagram handle is Sports Podiatry Info. And it's basically a collection of my running shoes and some infographics that I do, which kind of touch on some of these regular myths. And I try and frame them in a way that they're accessible to all, to runners and to fellow professionals. And we touch on things like why you shouldn't be worried if someone's called you a pronator, why the term overpronation should be discontinued because it's a poor term. Things like when should you replace your running shoes. So a lot of the stuff we've touched on, I've developed infographics with links to some of the science behind it. So yeah, Sports Podiatry Info on Instagram is it's kind of where I hang.
Great, thank you so much for chatting with me.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
So I hope that was a really useful discussion for everyone listening. As Ian said, you can find him on Instagram by searching Sports Podiatry Info, and you can follow me using the handle @MarathonMedic. Thanks so much for listening.